My name's Beth Rouge. I work with the Splenda brand, and we're so happy that you came here to join us at this breakfast session. Many of you very likely know about Splenda through our little yellow packets. And so if you know our brand from that, you would be absolutely accurate to think of that as soon as you hear the word Splenda. This week, one of the things that we want to do with you is to share with you how we have expanded into other categories of products to help make it easier for people to reduce their sugar and to achieve their health goals. And so you can see products that we have today beyond Splenda yellow packets in Splenda stevia products, Splenda monk fruit products, and many other areas such as coffee creamers, Splenda diabetes care shakes, and hopefully many of you are enjoying the Splenda syrup that we have recently launched. We do this because we're a mission-led organization, and our goal is to help people live happier, healthier, and longer lives by making it easier to reduce their sugar intake. We're very committed to this, and you'll see this in a variety of different ways this week. We have much in the way of innovation of our products. We are here this week with many educational resources so that you have the tools that you need from us to be able to support discussions with your clients. We have partnerships that we engage in with the American Diabetes Association, with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, and Children with Diabetes to help people be able to better understand the resources that they have available to them. And one of the newest areas that we are extremely proud of is that we have recently opened a new Splenda Stevia Farms in Central Florida. Now, this is a very big deal for us because we brought this farm to life and have now opened it so that we can make the best tasting products for people. And one area that we have really dug into is to ensure that by opening this, that we are bringing a new innovation and a new American industry to our country. Today, much of the stevia that we use is brought in from overseas, and that causes a more significant footprint. So by doing this, we see that we eliminate much of the trucks and the shipping cargo that you require to get stevia here, and that allows us to have a more sustainable model for ourselves and our communities to use. Ultimately, because we have the ability to make the best tasting products, this helps our consumers to be able to have success whenever they start to reduce their sugar and they use products that have a sweetener or other products that we're making, and that helps them to stick with the products as well and have success with this. So we're here this week to be able to share all of this innovation with you and to be able to bring you resources, samples, educational materials that can help you be able to share this content with your consumers. If you swing by our booth, we can make sure that we get you signed up to receive these things through email and through snail mail by shipping it out to you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you the speakers that we have today for our session, a closer look at low and no-calorie sweeteners, which is safety, efficacy, and implementation that you will be hearing about. So the first speaker is Holly Moran. She is a registered dietitian and a certified diabetes care and education specialist. She works with the Splenda brand as the manager of nutrition and science communications. She also formerly worked at one of the largest endocrinology practices in the state of Indiana. And she leads all of these Splenda partnerships that we have with the ADA, the JDRF, and Children with Diabetes. We're also joined by Dr. Neil Skolnick, who is a physician, and he's the associate director with the Family Medicine Residency Program in Abington, a professor of family community medicine at Thomas Jefferson, and he is also the host and the producer of the American Diabetes Association podcast called Diabetes Core Update. So I welcome them both to come up to the stage here, and let's give them a round of applause as we get started.
Thanks, Beth. All right. Hi everyone, it's so good to have you this morning. Hope you're enjoying your breakfast meals and your coffees and starting to wake up here on this beautiful morning in Savannah. So we're going to get started. This is our accreditation statement. Here are our disclosures, mine and Dr. Skolnick's. And then we're just going to jump through these learning objectives. So first we're going to be looking at the evidence that explains why added sugars are contributing to the obesity and diabetes epidemics that we're seeing today. We're going to be defining the low and no-calorie sweetener category. Then we're going to be looking at the scientific literature, the most recent of this, that is on the safety and efficacy of low and no-calorie sweeteners. And then we're going to be wrapping up with how your patients can implement these sweeteners into their dietary eating patterns. So let's start off with looking at the challenge at hand, so these rising trends in diabetes and obesity. So we'll start here with obesity. So there's no surprise here. We know that it's been trending up over time in the United States. Among US adults, here is what's shown. And this is from the CDC. And over time, we can see that trend line just going up here. So now today, over 40% of US adults has obesity, and over 9% have severe obesity. Now, the CDC does track this using body mass index, BMI, and while we know as dietitians this isn't always the best indicator of someone's health status and weight status, it is important for tracking over time because they are using the same measurement every year when they're measuring this or every periodic time when they're measuring this. So it helps us understand that, yeah, it is going up over time. So prediabetes and diabetes also on the rise, and we've been seeing this. So every few years, the CDC comes out with a National Diabetes Statistics Report. And so in this most recent one, we did see that there were some significant jumps in prediabetes and diabetes. So in 2018, we knew that there were 88 million adults with prediabetes, so over a third of the US adult population. This jumped to 96 million in the most recent report. So now nearly 40%, okay? So of course, we can probably attribute some of this that maybe people are going and getting screened and diagnosed more, but we also see that there's other factors at hand. Diabetes as well, so 34 million around there in 2018, and then this jumped to over 37 million in the most recent report, so nearly 12% of Americans with diabetes today. So earlier this year, in the American Diabetes Association journal, Diabetes Care, there was this article. I thought it was really fascinating. You might have heard some things on the news about this report. But they're looking at the projections of where we're going with diabetes in youth population, so those under age 20. And they looked at both type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. 2017, we saw that there was 185,000 youths with type 1, 228,000 with type 2. They believe that if the increasing trends in incidence that we observed between 2002 and 2017 continue, if it continues to rise like it has been, then in the year 2060, we're going to have over 300,000 youths with type 1 and over 220,000 with type 2. So this is a 65% increase in type 1 and almost a 700% increase in type 2. So this is serious stuff, and it's really, really just stressing the importance of primary prevention, screening, and what we need to be doing to educate people on healthy eating habits and what they can do to prevent. Of course, with type 1, that involves more research, things like what the JDRF is doing today. But with type 2, we can definitely look at this from a good prevention standpoint. So how much added sugars are Americans consuming versus what's recommended? We're going to start jumping into the sugar piece now, okay? So we can understand that there's a lot of things that could be contributing to obesity and diabetes rising in the United States and around the world as well. But as dietitians, we recognize that diet is a big part of this as well, right? We cannot deny it. That's why our profession is so, so important. Overconsumption of added sugars is a problem, okay? It might be getting better for some people, but overall we see that it is still a very big concern here in the United States. So how much are we taking in? Well, according to the dietary guidelines, on average, Americans are consuming over 260 calories a day in added sugars. So that's about 17 teaspoons of added sugar. I like to think of it in teaspoons because I think that's a good visual for our patients and clients to understand. So what's recommended? The dietary guidelines recommends that we consume less than 10% of our calories per day from added sugars. So for a person that is on a 2,000 calorie diet, this would be less than 200 calories per day and less than 12 teaspoons a day. So if they're consuming that 17 teaspoons, they're way over. And that's just based on the 2,000 calorie diet. So if someone's taking in less than 2,000 calories, you can imagine the number would be smaller than that for the recommendation. The American Heart Association takes this a step further. They say we should keep it under 6% of calories per day. And they have good reasoning for that, and I'm going to go over that on the next slide. But for men, this amounts to about 9 teaspoons per day, and for women, 6 teaspoons per day. So this comes from the American Heart Association Science Advisory, and this is a statement they have here on added sugar. So they're saying that there's a robust body of evidence demonstrating that diets high in added sugars are linked to risk factors for cardiovascular disease. This includes obesity, dyslipidemia, elevated blood pressure, and chronic inflammation. And then they further state that if we do start reducing our intake of added sugar and limiting that, then it's going to help people reduce calorie intake and then thus be able to achieve their weight goal. So what are the top sources of added sugar? It is important to understand this as well, and this also comes from the dietary guidelines for Americans. So as we could see here, sugar-sweetened beverages. That always seems to be the biggest one, right? And from a logical standpoint, I can see why. I mean, we could drink a lot faster than we can eat. You could just kind of keep consuming. I mean, I talked to patients that would consume 24 cans of sweetened soda a day. You know, I mean, like, I don't know how they had time for anything, and they probably were going to the bathroom a lot, but it's unreal to see, you know, how much people take in and don't even realize it. And as you can see there, that's followed by desserts and sweet snacks. We have candy on there. Other sources, they didn't really explain what those are, but I guess we can imagine maybe those are condiments, things like that. But yeah, it's important to understand this. And like I mentioned before, we are seeing a little bit of a decline since 2002 in intake of sugar-sweetened beverages, which is really, really encouraging. But people are still consuming more than what's recommended. American Diabetes Association, they actually provided a statement specifically on sugar-sweetened beverages. So in their consensus report, they stated that sugar-sweetened beverage consumption significantly increased risks of type 2 diabetes, weight gain, heart disease, kidney disease, liver disease, and tooth decay. There are a lot of systematic reviews and meta-analyses supporting the link between sugar-sweetened beverage consumption and many health outcomes. One that the ADA is highlighting on here is that increasing a serving of a sugar-sweetened beverage by just one per day, by one more per day, that increases a person with prediabetes risk of type 2 by 26%. So that's significant, okay? Earlier this year, Dr. Skolnick actually sent this review over to me. This is an umbrella review that was published in the BMJ, and they looked at added sugar intake and many, many health outcomes. So there were 73 meta-analyses included in this review, 83 health outcomes, and over 8,000 unique articles that they looked at. And this map here shows the different health outcomes where they found a more significant association with those added sugar intakes. So you can see here the largest portion is endocrine and metabolic disorders. So this would include obesity, type 2 diabetes, gout, and metabolic syndrome. And then followed by that is cancer. Pancreatic cancer was one of the more strongly associated cancer types. And then we have cardiovascular disease. And then you see that's followed up by neuropsychiatric and dental. So these authors, I mean, they actually recommended, based on what they reviewed, that we consume less than 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day and less than 1 sugar-sweetened beverage per week, okay, based on what they found. So now we're going to look a little bit more about the science, which I love this stuff, I love science, and behind why sugars could be contributing to obesity and being a primary driver. Okay, so the first one we have here is the energy balance model. So as dietitians, we might know this as the calorie in, calorie out model, okay, which is controversial for sure. They did reformulate this model, and they still say overeating is the primary driver. You know, they still would attribute it to that, but they look more specifically this time at energy-dense, ultra-processed foods that are high in fat and sugar, and how that more so contributes. Over-consuming that leads to a person eating more calories than what their body is metabolizing, burning, and then that leaves you with more calories in your body, circulating in your body, and then that contributes to fat storage. Now, on the other side of this, you have the carbohydrate insulin model. So this is a different approach here where they're looking more at hormonal responses as that being a driver. So what they're saying is specifically it's high glycemic load, high sugar foods that causes the body to release a burst of insulin. And we know insulin is a storage hormone, so that's contributing to fat storage in the body. And then the calories circulating in the body drops, okay? And then that leaves the person feeling fatigue, hunger, and then they want to eat more. So essentially the model on the left here, the energy balance model, is saying that overeating is what contributes to obesity, and the one on the right is saying that being obese is what's contributing to overeating. So it's a little bit of a weird flip there on that. Of course, we have to keep in mind these are models, these are theories, but it's interesting to look at. The commonality between the two is that high sugar intake is a primary driver of obesity. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to point out here. Lots to dig up on this, but it's interesting stuff. IFIC, the International Food Information Council, releases a food and health survey every year. It should be coming out next week, I believe, if it's on time. So in the most recent survey, they asked Americans, hey, are you trying to reduce your intake of added sugar? And what we found out is 73% of Americans are saying, yeah, I'm trying to limit or avoid sugar, okay? And then of those 27% that said they're not, they asked them why. Why aren't you limiting your sugar intake? And they said, well, I like the taste of sweet foods and drinks. Don't want to give them up, so I'm not going to try to limit my sugar intake. That was the primary reason. For the people that are trying to limit their sugar intake, their top reason is because they want to avoid weight gain. Okay, so that's their big reason. So we have to really think how we can help our patients, our clients, reduce their sugar intake, because clearly most Americans want to do it, but how they can not sacrifice those sweet foods and drinks. And that's where I think the low and no calorie sweetener category fits really nicely, because we can kind of get the best of both worlds with that. So back to that food and health survey, the top reasons for why a person is using a low and no calorie sweetener is because they want to try to limit or avoid sugar, which we just talked about, save calories. That can be a way for them to try to prevent that weight gain. They believe sugar is not good for them. They prefer the sweetness or the taste of low and no calorie sweeteners. And then a healthcare professional, like Dr. Sklonik here, recommended that they avoid sugar or limit sugar. So those are the top reasons there. So here I just want to quickly just get through something. So I've been using the term low and no calorie sweeteners this entire time, so LNCS. That's what we tend to use over at Splenda more often. But there are different terms that can be used, and you'll see in the literature. So low-calorie sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners, that's what I see the ADA use a lot. Low-energy sweeteners, I see the World Health Organization use that term. High-intensity sweeteners, the FDA likes that one. Sugar substitutes, I think my patients would say that most often. Sometimes people say artificial. Sometimes they'll say natural, depending on which sweetener type they're talking about. And alternative sweeteners. So regardless of which term you use, they're all the same. They're synonyms, I would call them, for one another, but we just wanted to clarify that there. So let's look at how LNCS compares to different sweetener types. So low and no calorie sweeteners are sugar alternatives that contain 0 calories or very little calories and carbohydrates. And they are hundreds, if not thousands of times sweeter than traditional sugar. That's why you only need a little bit of it to sweeten your foods and drinks. You don't need very much. And that's also why they're often blended with some other kind of ingredient to help provide volume and texture. Because otherwise you would just have like a couple of little sprinkles in your coffee and it wouldn't distribute through the whole cup, okay? Examples, sucralose, stevia. Then you have your traditional sugars, monosaccharides, disaccharides. Let's take it back to biochem here. So these provide energy in the form of carbohydrates. Examples are fructose, sucrose, lactose, galactose, all that. And then we have our rare sugars. So these are also monosaccharides and disaccharides. So they are sugars, but they have a different chemical structure to them. And so that means that they don't metabolize the same way that traditional sugars do in the body. And the FDA allows that these rare sugars, like allulose and tagatose, they don't contribute to calories. So they're 0 calories on the nutrition label, but they still have carbohydrates. And in your dietitian mind, you're probably doing the math. You're like, wait, but there's 4 calories per gram in a carbohydrate. I don't understand. Well, with these, so it's actually like 0.2 grams or calories per gram of carbohydrate. So it's not 4 like a traditional sugar is. That's why we can claim this as 0 calories, okay? Then you've got sugar alcohols. So they have properties of both sugar and alcohols, why they're called sugar alcohols, right? And so these are derived from fruits and vegetables. And they're not quite as sweet as sugar typically, but sometimes they can be just as sweet as sugar. And examples of these are erythritol, sorbitol, things like that, and then the OL, right, alcohols. So here's just a table of different low and no calorie sweetener types, just for your information. You could find something like this easily on the FDA's website as well. We have here its relative sweetness to sugar, which I think is important because you might have some patients that don't like things super sweet. Some of them like it a little more mild. So something like a monk fruit is a little more mild. Okay, and then there's some more intense sweet ones that I like. And then metabolism, so that's just how it's processed in the body. And then characteristics here of heat stability. So if you have a patient that's interested in baking and cooking with a sweetener, that's important because certain types of sweeteners won't be able to hold up in an oven or over the stovetop. All right, so I'm going to be kicking it over to Dr. Skolnick, but are there any questions that you have right now that I could address? We rather sprinkle them in instead of leaving them all out to the end. So,
see a question over there.
Oh yeah, sure.
I was unfamiliar with that term, rare sugars. Where would that be used?
Rare sugars. Yeah, so have you ever seen allulose as a sweetener at the store? That's probably the most common rare sugar that we would see out in like the shelf in like the baking section of the store. Sometimes you'll see it blended in with other sweeteners. Like if you have ever seen low-calorie sweetener like baking items, so they're typically blended in with there because they're not quite as sweet as sugar. A lot of times they're mixed with other items. But those are actually, they brown more like sugar, so people tend to favor those for baking, things like that. Mm-hmm. Good question. Oh yeah, another one here.
Is this monk fruit one, does it have added erythritol like the stevia Splenda?
Yes.
Or is it just pure monk?
Yes, so when you see, so she asked about monk fruit. So yes, monk fruit is often blended with erythritol. Again, back to that thing about you have to have some kind of filler in order to have the volume and the texture that you want. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so that would be like a sugar alcohol mixed with a low and no calorie sweetener. Oh, here you go. Great question. So we're gonna kick it back over here now.
Holly, that was fantastic. Are people hearing me? Is the volume?
Oh, no. I'll be back. Don't clap yet.
So,
I think we have
one
more
other question there.
Sorry, I had a quick question. Pre-pandemic, I had some patients who would talk about the products that they would purchase with Splenda in it, and then with the pandemic and since it's been declared over, they still can't find some products that have Splenda in it, such as Diet Coke with Splenda. Mm-hmm. Is there a shortage, or is there movement to get some of these products back into the marketplace?
Right, there's no shortage for sure. I would say it's probably just whoever's manufacturing those particular items, they may have just opted not to use it, or they're reformulating, or maybe they are having some struggle with issue, but there's no shortage from what we understand. No, good question.
Holly, again, that was a fantastic overview and setting the stage for what's really been an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. Before I start on my section, which is going to emphasize safety and efficacy, I want to thank everyone here. So I'm a family doctor, a primary care physician, an academic primary care physician. And one of the things that is just so apparent to me is that what I and most of my colleagues do is emphasize the use of medicines, right? Medicines are very important, not to downplay that. They're important for people who need them. But what I'll acknowledge, don't do as much as we should is pay attention to the foundations of health and how to treat disease. And an example, and as I say that, I'm thinking of an article that came out in the British Medical Journal, and we're going to review this in an upcoming podcast, in the British Medical Journal just a week ago, and they looked at, this was a review of essentially all the literature out there on different dietary interventions in people with cardiovascular disease. And one example of the results of this overview of the literature was for people with cardiovascular disease, the Mediterranean diet, when compared to non-Mediterranean diets, just whatever the comparator was in the different studies, decreased over 5 years the incidence of mortality by approximately 30% and cardiovascular mortality by a full 45%. Now, it is hard to find a medicine that has that level of effect, yet we know that the number of people who should be referred to dietitians is only about 5 to 10% of the people. We only refer about 5 to 10% of the people who should be referred on to you all for the important input that you give to our patients with regard to that foundational input, which is diet. Now, we also know, Holly, as you said, that obesity has increased enormously. It is epidemic. Over 40% of the U.S. population is categorized as obese, and that one of the critical contributors to obesity is, as you said, is sugar. So what do we do about that? And one of the odd things, we're going to talk about this in the safety part, is that there's all these myths out there that sometimes get in the way of people who need the interventions we have to offer, accepting them. Before I start on the part on safety, I'm just curious if you don't have to come to the mic or anything, but yell loud. Are there what have you heard from your clients about concerns around low and no calorie sweeteners? Anybody? Causes cancer. The winner is the loudest person talking, remember. Anyone else loud? Because I know there were other things said. So causes cancer, what's that? It makes them eat more. Thank you. What's that? Messes with brain chemistry. That's interesting. Umbrella term, right. Any others? One more, say. Yeah.
Yeah, there was a study done in February 2023 about erythritol that it causes a 20% increase in cardiovascular risk. So my clients are saying, well, it depends on the levels of the amount of
Yeah. So can increase cardiovascular risk, particularly stated here, a study in February with erythritol. And I'll say another piece of that, because you said it so nicely, a study in February of this year. One of the things, and I've written about this, I've published over 400 articles on different things, and one of the things in the medical literature, one of the things we need to be very careful about, and I'm so glad you said it the way it is that a study said, this is complex information, and we want to be very careful, and we'll come back to that study later, but we want to be very careful not to change all of our habits based on any single study that comes out, but rather look at, and it is hard to do, right? Because none of us know the world literature. There's way too much out there. But be very careful not to take any single study and suddenly change everything that we were doing that was based on a ton of science to that point, based on a single study, but rather figure out over time how to integrate new information, right? Because progress in medicine is essentially a zigzag path toward truth. It is not a straight line. And we don't want to be confused by each new thing that comes out. So what I want to do now is go over safety with particular attention to the things that you all pointed out, right? Cancer, does it increase appetite? Does it affect cardiovascular outcomes? And to do so, I'm going to go over both the studies and then also the summary of the evidence put out by large organizations that we trust, like the American Heart Association, like the American Diabetes Association, and others. To start with, though, it's important to understand how low and no-calorie sweeteners, the approval process. So I've presented at the FDA on a number of occasions for medicines as part of the approval process. I'm very familiar with the FDA approval process for medications. For low and no-calorie sweeteners, there are two different categories of FDA approval, and they all have to be FDA approved. There's food additive line of approval, and there's GRAS, generally recognized as safe approval. They actually have the same process of literature overview, the same process of scientists critically looking at the available literature to look at safety. The only difference between the two is that on the generally recognized as safe, that literature is publicly available. It's been around for a long time. Anyone can look at it. For the food additive category, that has to be literature, that is essentially literature that there's not enough out there, so the companies that want FDA approval to put the food additive in the food supply has to put the science together, put in an application with rigorous science to the FDA that's then reviewed. I can tell you what then happens, whether it is with medicines or with low and no-calorie sweeteners, is that scientists then review the evidence, scientists who understand methodology in detail and you can get a sense, if this is their charge, they are not necessarily friends of the company asking for the application. They're charged with, they are neutral individuals charged with safety for the public, and they are incredibly critical. Being on some committees that have put in for pharmacologic approval for new medicines, I can tell you that the questions asked to the committee are very tough ones. The difference between FDA approval of medicines and food additives is that, in a way, food additives is a tougher process because medicines, remember, are approved for ages 12 and up, for 18 and up, adults, 12 to 18, kids, and a separate category for pregnancy, right? And there are a ton of medicines that we use that you can't use in kids and can't use in women who are pregnant. Food additives have to have a level of safety such that they are approved population-wide, because we know that if it's in, name whatever, sodas, cookies, additives to other things, that it's going to be used by kids. It's going to be used by pregnant women. So there has to be safety across the population. So a very rigorous approval process. Then there is what is termed the acceptable daily intake. Not only is it approved, but then the amount that's allowed to be added, the acceptable daily intake is an estimated conservative amount of low and no-calorie sweetener that can be safely consumed by a person on a daily basis over the course of a lifetime without risk from exposure to that. And then the FDA says what we can use, what we can put into the foods we eat, is something that would be expected to be used at 100-fold lower level than the acceptable daily intake. So not only do we go through this rigorous approval process that looks at safety, but then we add an enormous cushion of safety, right? 100-fold lower than that level, right, which is felt to be safe, which is pretty amazing. Now, let me tell you, we would not have a medication process that does that, so we wouldn't have any medicines. You would never, right, give metformin, at 100-fold high. No, right. You're laughing because it doesn't work. Wouldn't do that. So that the layer of safety here is pretty amazing. So some of us may choose to accept at face value that assessment by experts. I actually think that's that actually tells you the summary of safety, but we as individuals who care about safety for our clients, for our patients, also want to have some sense of what the literature says. What has been looked at in this area, and that's what we're now going to go over. And we're going to look at different areas that you all, and this is not some magic trick where, like, hey, tell me what card I'm showing. Look, we had this here. No. We kind of know we know the general things out there, and I was just curious what came up, and what was interesting was, and the thing I've heard most is the causes cancer thing that you had said, and we'll go over the reason why. The reason why that is such a prevalent myth out there is that actually, if we go back to the 1970s, which I suspect is before many of us, not all of us, were born, there actually was a real concern about a relationship was reported between saccharin and bladder cancer in male, not female, rats. And so that led to a lot of concern, because we should be concerned if we see a study saying that. So in 1981, saccharin was listed in the U.S. National Toxicology Program's report on carcinogens. So this myth we hear that you raised is based on some concerns that were real back 40 and 50 years ago. Over the next 20 years, from 1980 to 2000, because of that concern, there were a lot of studies done, both mechanistic studies, looking at basic science studies in humans, and epidemiologic studies in humans. And what they found was that the way that saccharin is metabolized in male rats has a distinct metabolism that has no overlap with how it's metabolized in humans. And with a high level of certainty, they prove that there isn't a relationship between saccharin or any other low and no-calorie sweetener and cancer in human beings, such that, and it's very hard, right, once something's listed somewhere to delist it, but it was delisted from the U.S. toxicology report. So I think we can say now, with a high level of certainty, that there is no relationship between low and no-calorie sweeteners and cancer. We'll have time for questions, if there are any, in a little while. There'll be logical breaks. We don't have to save all questions at the end. And thank you for raising your hand quickly. But we will take time at specific points for that. Not mentioned, but I know I've heard from patients, is this issue between low and no-calorie sweeteners and type 2 diabetes. And Holly, you told the story of people who were drinking 24 cans of soda, and it just reminded me, and this reminds me of a patient I saw a few months ago who, this is someone who is about 60 years old. She has diabetes. Her A1C was not very good. It was about 9.2. And so I added on an additional medicine. She was on metformin. I added an SGLT2 and pagliflozin. And then I saw her back in 3 months. And as I usually do, I asked her to get an A1C prior to her seeing me. And her A1C came back at 7.2 instead of 9.2. And I saw the A1C before walking into the room, and I walked into the room and really excited, and I was very proud of myself. I had picked the right medicine, and she was doing well. And I sit down, I say, "It's so great, look how much better your A1C is." And she said, "Oh, that's great." And I say, "So that medicine is really working for you, right?" She goes, I never took it. And I'm like, you never took it, but your A1C is so much better. And she said, yeah, well, I realized after I went home that I'm drinking 2 of these big gulp sodas every day. And I decided I was going to stop that. And that was what made the difference. Now, right, we learn from our patients, we learn from our clients, and I was, I'm aware of diet and its input, and I talk on sugar, and I was in a rush that day, and I didn't take the time that I should have to ask her the questions that I should have about dietary input to her diabetes, and it was obviously humbling. So when they've looked at low and no calorie sweeteners and diabetes, sure enough, as expected, low and no calorie sweeteners, actually people do better on it over the week after eating than compared to sugar sweetened beverages. When they look large, what's interesting here, the myths, a lot of the myths come from observational trials. Observational trials actually showed an increase in diabetes, but, and this is going to be a theme we're going to see again and again, something we learned back in school was observational trials or cohort studies are subject to something called confounding variables or reverse causality. A great example, and this is a made-up example, so this isn't real literature, but it proves, it underscores the point. There is more heat stroke in months where ice cream is consumed in high quantities, right? It isn't that ice cream causes heat stroke, it's that you eat more ice cream in July and August, which is when you see heat stroke. So reverse causality. We're going to see this again later when it comes to efficacy and weight loss. The point being that the people who often choose low and no calorie sweeteners in higher proportion than those who don't are people who are obese or who want to manage their weight and are struggling with it. So it's not surprising that if you just look at a large cohort of individuals, those who are choosing more of these are also people who have more of a tendency to weight gain. When you look at and control the studies for BMI, that attenuates that relationship between low and no calorie sweeteners and diabetes. So this issue of confounding variables, such that the American Diabetes, and this comes from the Standards of Care, January of this year, said non-nutritive sweeteners do not appear to have a significant effect on glycemic management. They can reduce overall calorie and carbohydrate intake as long as individuals are not compensating with additional calories from other food sources. Low and no calorie sweeteners help, but they don't help this idea, and we'll see this theme again, if you compensate by eating a big piece of pie because you had a diet soda, right? It's kind of obvious. Okay, American Heart Association, 2 large prospective studies, decades of follow-up. This is a quote from their scientific statement from 2018. Consumption of low and no-calorie beverages was not associated with the risk of coronary artery disease or related biomarkers. Sugar-sweetened beverages, though, on the other hand, have been associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease. We need to find substitutes, we have, for sugar-sweetened beverages. Relationship with stroke, same thing. Observational trials increase attenuated when you control for weight and BMI going into the studies. Effect on appetite. Someone over here raised your hand about the effect on appetite. Multiple studies with a high degree of confidence show no effect on appetite. And in fact, 12 studies, when pooled to address this question, looking at consumption of calories in the days after beginning low and no calorie sweeteners, show that on the average, I mean, if you cut out 200 calories of sugar, you compensate a little bit. About a third of those calories are compensated, but 2/3 of those calories remain as a deficit, which is what we want. This is not going to be surprising when we talk in a minute about efficacy, because we see that effect in prospective studies on efficacy. So the conclusion from a lot of studies, because this is a big issue, was that low and no calorie sweeteners do not increase appetite. Gut microbiome, the current literature examining the effects of low and no calorie sweeteners on the human gut are limited. This was in the American Heart Association scientific statement. It does show some changes in the microbiome. The scientific advisory said we can't really tell, does this matter? There's very limited evidence in humans. What I'll say, and this is me, so this is not a brilliant scientific committee, that when you look at microbiome on a sugar-sweetened diet, sugar affects our microbiome. If there's a change, that might be a positive change because we're not supposed to. If we go back to the early 1800s, the average person had under 10 pounds a day of, not a day, 10 pounds a year of sugar. Now it's over 100 pounds. Has that affected us? Yes, in a negative way. So if there's a change, it might be a positive change. I want to now go on to efficacy. Then before I hand the mic back over to Holly, we'll take questions and answers on safety and efficacy. Does that make sense? So efficacy, one of the things that the thing we care about primarily is safety. We want a high degree of confidence about safety when we suggest things to our clients, to our patients. I think from my point of view, we have that high degree of confidence. The other thing we want to do, of course, is do something that works. Not a bad idea. And here this becomes complicated. And I like this illustration because there is the simple but wrong answer, right? Taking one study and running with it. Looking at observational trials and accepting the results without thinking. Or there's the more complex, we have to think it through, but often the right end. This is a kind of not a bad life lesson either, right? So logically, replacing one bottle of sugar-sweetened beverages a day, what happens? Now, one of my favorite philosophers was the famous catcher, Yogi Berra, who said, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they're not, right? And so logically, if you take one sugar-sweetened beverage a day, 20-ounce bottle of soda, 200 kilocalories a day, times 30 days is 6,000 calories per month. For a year, 72,000 calories per year. So if you cut that out, you'd lose 20 pounds in a year, logically. But, right, and we all know this. Logically, you'd think that would work, but it doesn't work that way. That's not the way our bodies work. There's all these complicated mechanisms that seek to maintain whatever that weight is that your set point is at. So let's look at the evidence, because logic doesn't always fit the evidence. Okay, so looking at a meta-analysis of observational trials showed a small, non-significant increase in weight and an increase in BMI. Small in the case of weight, non-significant. But again, the issue with observational trials, and we see this coming up again and again, is that observational trials are plagued with the issue of confounding. And that the people who choose low and no-calorie sweeteners more often heavier people or people who are struggling with weight choose low and no-calorie sweeteners more often than those who have no issue. And therefore, it's not surprising that they gain a little weight. So what happens is when we look at the second bullet here, a systematic review of 14 prospective studies evaluating the relationship with the risk of obesity, metabolic, and type 2 diabetes found that there were positive associations, but those associations became non-significant when controlled for weight and BMI. So there's this kind of thing out there that, oh yeah, they don't work. Well, that turns out it's based on some trials, but not a careful enough look at those trials. So some trials, to reduce the possibility of confounding, what they did was they said, let's just look at people who increase their consumption of low and no-calorie sweeteners versus decrease. And it turns out that those trials show a decrease in weight. So the American Heart Association summary in their scientific advisory from 2018 said reverse causality and weight cannot be ruled out as driving factors in observational trials. So what do we do when we really want it closer to truth? Prospective studies. Prospective studies, a trial sugar-sweetened beverage, New England Journal of Medicine, over 600 children. randomized to low and no calorie sweetener beverage versus sugar sweetened beverage. What they found was about a 2-pound less weight gain over 18 months. Meta-analysis, prospective trials, and body weight. This is from 2014, 15 randomized trials, showed that on the average, there was a decrease of 0.8 kilograms, about 2 pounds over the course of the studies. The average length of the studies was 12 to 15 weeks. When we move ahead to a study from 2020, Obesity reviewed 20 randomized trials, and this is our most important source of this information. Most of the studies were 12 weeks long. Low and no calorie sweeteners led to approximately 3 pounds of weight loss over 12 weeks. So this is a big deal. This is 20 studies, prospective, randomized studies. So this, to me, is the hang your hat on. Now, this is not to say that rapidity of weight loss will continue forever. Obviously, it doesn't. If it continued forever, we'd disappear in 2 years. But it says that there's very real weight loss, as shown in prospective trials associated with use of it. What they found was, compared to water, no difference. It's what we'd expect. But when compared to sugar-sweetened beverages, sucrose, lower weight with use of low and no calorie sweeteners. Unrestricted dietary status, people eat whatever they want. Low and no calorie sweeteners work. They found a trend toward lower weight loss, but not statistically significant in people who are on weight reduction diets. Not surprising, right? This alone doesn't do it. This is part of our toolkit for weight loss. So it contributes to the weight loss that a more broad diet does. Those who are overweight and obese find that. I'm only going to mention there are 2 trials now that look at low and no calorie sweeteners and hepatic fat. Turns out it looks like it helps decrease hepatic fat. I only mention it because NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, is becoming a bigger and bigger thing that we're dealing with. So randomized trial clinical evidence, the American Heart Association scientific summary. Short-term evidence suggests that replacement of sugar-sweetened beverages with low-calorie beverages can help in the management of overweight. American Diabetes Association 2023, the use of non-nutritive sweeteners as a replacement for sugar-sweetened products may reduce overall calories and carb intake as long as there's not a compensatory increase. There's evidence that low and no-calorie sweeteners are a viable alternative to water. Putting it all together now, and then we'll take some questions. Then, Holly, I'll hand over the floor to you. When used judiciously, this was a 2012 statement, non-nutritive sweeteners can facilitate reduction in added sugar intake, resulting in decreased energy and weight loss and weight control, promoting beneficial effects on relevant metabolic parameters, but won't be realized if you have a compensatory increase in other calories. The ADA's consensus report 2019, I'll point you to the middle there, minimize added sugars. Next, the American Heart Association advisory from 2018, use of low-calorie beverages may be an effective strategy to help control energy intake and promote weight loss. For adults who habitually consume sugar-sweetened beverages, low-calorie beverages may be a useful replacement strategy. The American Heart Association goes on to say use of alternatives to sugar-sweetened beverage with the focus on water, carbonated, unsweetened flavors should be encouraged. The potential benefits from low-calorie sweetener beverages as replacement for sugar-sweetened beverages will not be fully realized if their use is accompanied by compensatory intake. This is part of our toolkit and part of what we advise people as part of their full dietary plan. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, non-nutritive sweeteners work as a strategy for diet and health concerns, including the limiting of carbohydrate and energy intake, as well as blood glucose and/or weight management, favorable for use in diabetes. I sum up the totality of evidence in a single sentence, because I like stuff I can remember. Low and no-calorie sweeteners are a safe tool that can be used as part of a comprehensive approach to weight loss and maintenance, but should not be thought of as a complete answer or a complete approach in and of itself. It's part of our comprehensive approach to weight loss. Why don't we take just a couple of minutes for question and answer here, and then Holly, I'll turn the floor back over to you. One or two questions if anyone has. Yes?
Question on the microbiome.
Yeah.
So, from what I hear you saying, there's limited evidence on what we know.
Yeah.
So, I deal with a lot of people with GI problems.
Yeah.
You know, so, assuming, you know, we do want to be cautious with them,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think is a reasonable amount to recommend in terms of sweeteners? So, because we don't really know.
Yeah. So the question is, if we're looking at particular populations, you deal with a lot of people with GI issues, should we view that differently than the population as a whole? I think your point is an excellent one, that if we are dealing with a particular segment and there are not studies to guide us, we then are cautious. And what I would say here is, as far as I know, there's no data to say that this is a problem in that group. Should we be cautious? Of course. Is water a good choice? Of course. But remember, Voltaire, the writer philosopher, said we shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good. So yeah, is water a good choice? Of course it is. But there are people who are going to say, well, they're going to go home, at least from my office, saying, oh yeah, all I'm going to drink is water and I'll never touch anything with sugar again. And then that doesn't work. So if someone likes the sweetness, it is probably still a better choice, in my opinion, than sugar-sweetened beverages, which we know have a host of problems, including, and in certain, for certain GI issues, the inflammatory bowel diseases, the risk of cancer is very high long-term, right? And we know that there's a relationship between sugar and development of cancer for a number of reasons, a number of different cancers, colon cancer being one. I would opt for that being used, and in terms of amount, I think that 100-fold cushion reminds us nicely that there is a cushion in the recommended amounts. What I'm going to suggest is let me turn the floor over to you, Holly, and then we can take questions again at the end.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. So now we're going to wrap it up with implementation. Okay, so how your patients or clients can implement sweeteners into their eating pattern. So let's start with going over the American Diabetes Association's goals for nutrition therapy. I highlight a couple of them on here. So the first one is to maintain the pleasure of eating by providing positive messages about food choices, only limiting food choices when its indicator supported by scientific evidence, right? So as we saw, the dietary guidelines for Americans, they recommend cutting intake to less than 10% of calories per day, right, from added sugars. They didn't just do this because they're like, we just want to do it. They want to do it because there's scientific evidence to support that added sugars are not great for us, right? So we only want to be limiting when necessary. And maintaining the pleasure of eating is really important for us as dietitians. And then also, this goes back to what Dr. Skolnick was just saying about the toolbox, right? We want to be providing our patients, and this is particular to diabetes, but I would say for any patient, with practical tools for day-to-day meal planning, okay? If we give them the tools, show them how to use the tools, okay? It's not just about like, go try this and then let them go off to the store and fend for themselves. Because I had patients that would sometimes cry in a grocery store because they get so overwhelmed by the shelf. And so it's important for us to teach them the how as well. So back to that food and health survey that I was talking about earlier on in the presentation. They also ask Americans, what is the top driver for or reason for why you buy a food or a beverage? And every year that I look at this survey, taste is number one. Taste is the main reason why someone is going to buy a certain food or beverage. We're in hard economic times right now. There's no doubt about that. So price is coming in second, and I think it's coming in a little bit stronger and stronger. So that's why it is really important to consider that all when making your recommendations. So this is hot off the press. In the March edition of the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they came out with guidance on medical nutrition therapy for adults with overweight or obesity. And we haven't seen guidance like this since 2014. So a lot of stuff has happened since 2014, right? So I really like they provided a table in there of different dietary approaches that your patients can take when they're trying to lose weight or maintain weight. And there's a lot of them on here, a lot of popular ones that we know of. You mentioned Mediterranean diet, DASH diet. We got My Plate on here, low carb. And so the point I want to make here with these is that low and no calorie sweeteners can be a tool, a part of any of these dietary approaches. If someone is on the Mediterranean diet and they want to make some kind of sweet balsamic dressing for a salad, then they can use a low and no calorie sweetener. Or maybe they're trying to do My Plate, and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I, get my starch portion on here, but I don't want it to be too sweet or whatnot. It's like a low and no calorie sweetener can be a part of that, okay? So the low and no calorie sweetener category, I mentioned the different sweetener types in that table, and you might think of them as being the packets, right? These are the ones you probably saw out there on the breakfast buffet. But they do come in many different forms. So it's not just the packets, as Beth had mentioned. There's also pouches, jars, liquids, and then there's blends where they might be blended with sugar to help people kind of use that as like a stepping stone to get them away from sugar. Sugar reduction would be their goal. And so these different forms can be used in different ways. And again, going back to that, how you want to be showing the patient not just the what, but the how, in that you can show them like examples like this. So for instance, if they're consuming even just one bottle of sweet tea per day, which is 190 calories, 48 grams of added sugar, they could try to swap that out and start using packets in, brewed tea at home. Or they could buy unsweetened tea and then sweeten it at home. And then that would be 0 added sugars. Let's say they like that to-go oatmeal, that fast food oatmeal, which has 320 calories, 18 grams of added sugar. Well, they could try to make some oatmeal at home, and then they could use the jar to sprinkle it on their oatmeal and sweeten it that way. And that would significantly reduce the sugar. And then we have here a packaged brownie. Maybe start baking, try it out, see what you can do. We have to build the confidence and to be able to do these things. Because I know I remember I had a patient who was like, microwaving is too much. Like, I can't do that. Like, I'm like, okay, let's do baby steps then. Like, we're gonna just let's make a sandwich. And so, we can do these little things, these little recommendations and just kind of help to build their confidence. And when you show them the calorie and sugar reduction, that can be really eye-opening for them as well. So now we're going to kind of pivot here to some of these psychological approaches that we can take with our patients and clients. And I think of this as the why, the when, and the how. So first, try to get to understand like why they are engaging or not engaging in a certain health behavior. So for instance, like a person that's consuming 24 sodas a day, why are they doing it? Are they doing it because the caffeine jolt? It's fizzy, it's sweet, it's cold. Why? What is it? What is the psychological reasoning behind that? Okay? And then the when will they change the behavior? So let's say they're like, absolutely not giving up anything. I'm not, nope. So maybe during that first session, they're not going to be giving up that soda. But maybe by the second session, when you kind of start to talk with them a little bit more, build that rapport with them, we can cut down by 2 sodas a day or something like that, and then slowly work from there. And then the how, so that was kind of what I was just alluding to. How are they going to do it? Well, maybe it's like a stepping stone thing. Or maybe you're going to say, hey, you can get some sparkling water and you can put some liquid water flavoring in that, and that you'll get your fizzy, you'll get your cold, and you'll get your sweet. And then, hey, now you've got it and you don't have all that sugar in there. So in that article that was just released in the Journal of Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they provided this really nice flow chart that I really liked. I encourage you guys to look back to that if you're a subscriber to that journal. So they start here in the nutrition care process with assessing. So very much so in this edition of the guidance for overweight and obesity, they emphasize values and goals, that we should always be putting our patients' values and goals first. We might have our agenda. Some of us might be a little type A and be like, no, this is the schedule, this is the agenda of what I want to talk about with you. But we need to put their values and goals first. So that's where that kind of why comes in. You're going to start doing that interviewing with them, right? And getting to understand why they're changing or not changing their behavior. And then you may need to refer out to someone else and get the team together. Not that you're not going to see them anymore, but a behavioral health specialist, if you feel like there's a bigger issue at hand that's out of your scope of practice, pull the team in, get everyone together to help this person. And then diagnosing the nutrition problem. And then there's these intervention approaches and dietary interventions. So this is really tackling the when and the how here. So the intervention approaches that you might take, motivational interviewing is a very, very big one right now. I know a lot of people are trying to get into that motivational interviewing practice because it is a really great way to kind of get down and help the patient reflect back to you, what they're feeling, and you're just kind of pulling and drawing that information out of them. And then dietary intervention, so that's actually giving them the tools, the meal plan, whatever it is that they're going to need to reduce the sugar in their diet. And then finally, monitoring and evaluating. How's their progress going, right? So what can you do to help support them so that they're not falling back down into those lesser healthy habits? So again, assessing, understand why they're making those changes or not making them. When are they going to be ready to do it? When are they going to be ready to cut that sugar intake? And then how are they going to do it? Okay. So this is our summary. So we talked about the sugar as a contributor to overweight and obesity and diabetes. We talked about different low and no-calorie sweeteners. We looked at the totality of the evidence, which shows that low and no-calorie sweeteners are a safe tool, an approach for weight loss and maintenance, and how they can be implemented. So now we're going to take some questions from you all, and I believe there are some mics, so if you want to be heard, we can get those tossed around.
And let me say, if there are questions that we don't have a chance to get to, because we only have about 4 minutes left,
Yeah.
Holly and I will stay up here, and if you want to come ask questions individually, and we'll gather around in a circle.
And we'll also be at the
Happy to take
booth
them.
as well, yeah.
Let's go here.
First, I'd like to say I love your socks.
Oh, God. Well, thank you.
Second, I'd like to know on the research, if there is research, the effect of Splenda sweetened products that are usually no calorie when you're intermittent fasting, not just for weight loss or fat loss, but for autophagy. How does that affect it? If it engages the digestive system or not? I know it's limited research.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that having been, it's a good question. I'm not aware of it being specifically looked at.
So what I would encourage you to do, I had that slide that had the table of how each sweetener is metabolized in the body. So you'll get access to the slides. Look through that, because if there's a particular sweetener type that you're looking at for somebody who's doing this intermittent fasting, Splenda, yeah, sucralose in specific. So it goes through the body unchanged. I mean, so it doesn't get metabolized the same way that a traditional sugar would. It does not stimulate that appetite. It does not affect the same way sugar does. So you can expect that there would not be a glycemic impact or anything from it.
But it hasn't been specifically studied for autophagy.
I will say no. I don't know of anything, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So.
Why don't we take one last question and.
Hi, great presentation, you guys.
Thank you.
So I think that we all are clear that using non-nutritious sweeteners over sugar and diabetes and obesity is very clear. In South Florida, where I live, where everyone thinks they know everything about nutrition, is what are we doing about the generally regarded as safe? Is it really okay for somebody to be drinking 2 quarts of Crystal Light a day, or only using Splenda versus any of the others? I think what I've come to realize is because there's so much negativity in terms of the artificial sweeteners, is if you're using a little bit of each kind, you're probably A-okay, rather than one and completely just using the Splenda. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's really a preference. I mean, there might be some people that I'm going to call my husband right here. He's a sucralose guy, and so he really sticks on that one. And so I don't think that necessarily someone has to really kind of mix them up, to be safe. And using different types, because remember that ADI that you had spoken of, the acceptable daily intake, there's such a huge buffer cushion between what people typically consume and what they research. And we find that no one even goes close to those recommended. And the ADI, again, is based on a daily consumption since someone's born, since the day they're born till the day they die, as if they're consuming 28 packets of sucralose a day. That's what the ADA, and no one is doing that.
And you would say
Yeah.
across the board with all of the non-nutritious sweeteners that that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, with FDA.
I'd be comfortable with that because I think it's the layers of protection. One is the carefulness, both on food additives and generally recognized as safe, on the chemical side of things, and then that cushion of 100. It's very hard to get anywhere near there, so I would be comfortable. I want to say to everybody, thank you so much for being so engaged, for being so interested. We really appreciate the interest. As Holly said, we'll be there. And Holly, it's just such a pleasure
Yeah, thank you.
doing this with you.